Okay. So ultimately, that's a decision that can be made internally. I understand that the overall budget is a constant pressure point. But
That's right.
Okay. Yeah, I think, we certainly were a little kind of shocked by some of the numbers with regards to the backlog, and very much encourage your work in trying to obtain the funding necessary to get the staffing you need to handle this backlog.
I'm confident that we will be able to come back to you this time next year with some good data showing some significant progress on lowering the backlog.
Good.
Yeah, I think that's what we all wanted to hear. But just to follow up on something else, so this 2.7 million or whatever that didn't get spent, that couldn't have been used to hire more attorneys.
It's not our money to spend. It's the commission it's appropriated to the commission.
So was that a Department of Finance error? Should the money have been appropriated to the AG instead of?
There's a reimbursement situation or a revolving fund at the Attorney General. So agencies or departments that utilize the Attorney General services have to have an appropriation within their budget to support paying for services at the Attorney General. The Attorney General's office has provisional authority in the Budget Act to temporarily increase workforce within each budget year with temporary staff to accommodate additional resources from departments and agencies as available. So in this instance, there was provisional authority. I don't think that the Attorney General's office utilized that authority this year. There may have been.
We did. 2 of those 5 positions are pursuant to the provisional authority.
Okay. So they have provisional authority. They could utilize the entire CTC resource allocation within their provisional authority. That's what I've been told by an individual from the Department of Justice. So.
Okay, good to get this straight now so that next year we really don't have this come up again. Thank you.
Realize that would be temporary help, and there may be issues internally with a desire to hire permanent positions over temporary positions, or maybe the difficulty in hiring temporary positions, because if it's a temporary position, some people may not be interested in.
So the dollars rest at the CTC, and the way the AG's office gets it is CTC pays for services that the AG provides, but the AG right now doesn't have enough staffing to provide the service that you could use, because this sounds like a chicken and egg kind of problem. And it seems like there should be some way within California's financial system to fix this. I don't know if I've heard it yet. Is there?
I think that the AG's office has undergone discussions with finance, and I think they've been productive in getting down to the solutions at hand. I don't have anything final to share with you today, but I can tell you that there have been very fruitful discussions and that we are looking at our options.
Could you share those with us by, say, May 1st?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to come back.
I'd appreciate that. Thank you all. If there are no other questions, I'd like to thank and excuse this panel and move on to our last panel. Dr. Mary Sandy will return, and Dan Kaplan from the LAO will join us. And we're going to be discussing now the teacher shortage issue, and we will begin with Dan Kaplan.
Good afternoon, Dan Kaplan with the Ledge Analyst's Office. A handout is being passed out to you that's going to largely coincide with my presentation. But what I'm going to do today is to first provide a brief overview of how one becomes a teacher, then move into some recent labor market trends in the market for teachers, describe evidence of shortages, then turn to various policy responses that have been attempted to kind of combat these shortages, and finally provide some broad issues for consideration for the legislature as it begins to determine which policy interventions, if any, are necessary. But first, how one becomes a teacher. There are 2 primary pathways to becoming a teacher, the first being a traditional pathway where a candidate first obtains their preliminary credential before entering the classroom and serving as the teacher of record, while the alternative pathway has a candidate enrolled in a credentialing program while serving as the teacher of record. Now, both of these pathways have the individual first obtaining their bachelor's degree and passing various state licensure exams. There are a number of emergency waivers that individuals can also teach on, though these are less commonly used. Turning to the graphic on page 2, these are what you see here are two common trends that researchers often look at when assessing the labor market for teachers. These are the number of new credentials issued each year, and this data comes from the CTC, versus the number of projected hires that districts intend to make in a given year. And this comes from the CDE. And what we see is that these two factors are somewhat cyclical in nature. The state undergoes periods of time in which it produces more credentials than individuals it hires, and other times in which it intends to hire more individuals than it credentials. We were producing more credentials than individuals we were hiring throughout much of the 2000s. However, this trend has reversed itself, causing some, within the recent years, since about 2012, 2013, causing some individuals to cite teacher shortages within the state. Now, one thing I want to highlight here, though, is that the market is much more nuanced than these simple comparisons, and there are many other factors that we must also consider. So on page 3, we highlight some of the key components of the market, being demand, supply, and turnover, and speak to some key factors that influence each of these. When looking at teacher demand, we see that the level of state funding that the state provides via the Proposition 98 minimum guarantee is a key factor impacting demand. About 70% of the time when the minimum guarantee increases year over year, we see an increase in projected hires. Similarly, about 80% of the time the minimum guarantee decreases year over year, we see a decrease in projected hires. Now, in recent years, the minimum guarantee has been increasing, and as a result, we've seen increases in projected hires. Other factors influencing demand include class size policies, such as class size reduction efforts, as well as student enrollment trends. And as we heard earlier today, student enrollment has not been growing in recent years and is not projected to grow in the near future. Now, turning to teacher supply, key factors to consider are the enrollment in teacher preparation programs. These are new candidates entering the market. And throughout much of the 2000s, we saw a significant decline in the number of individuals enrolled in these teacher preparation programs. However, these declines were largely tracking declines in the number of projected hires that districts were intending to make. Other key factors when looking at supply are the reentry into the teacher workforce of teachers who are credentialed but not currently working. Various studies have attempted to estimate this number, but many tend to find that at least 25% of new hires are teachers who are coming off of a leave of absence. The final trend when looking at supply is that of out-of-state teacher recruitment, and California sources a significant number of its teachers from out-of-state preparation programs. If we look over the life of Proposition 98, we see that about 18% of the teachers that California has credentialed in a given year come from out-of-state programs. Turning to teacher turnover, this is a key factor to look to because reducing teacher turnover can alleviate some of the staffing pressures that districts face. We find that nationwide, about 15% of teachers leave their positions in a given year, with about half of these completely leaving the profession, while the other half switch schools. Of those who leave the profession, about a third of them are leaving due to retirement reasons. So in summarizing all these findings and looking at the overall market for teachers, we see that the overall market for teachers seems to be in the process of adjusting itself. I mentioned earlier that we've been hiring quite substantially over recent years, and this has led more individuals to enter credentialing programs. We've seen a slight growth in the number of credentials issued in recent years, but after speaking with individuals who are involved with credentialing programs, we believe that this trend will continue into the future. In addition, many districts are independently engaging in somewhat robust out-of-state recruitment efforts, so we believe that we'll begin to see a greater supply statewide. Now, despite this trend, there are persistent shortage areas that research has found for decades tend to be an issue for the market. These shortage areas result in specific subject areas, these being special education tends to be the most acute shortage area, as well as science and math, as well as certain types of schools, being city center schools, low-income schools, and certain types of rural schools. On page 5, we summarized a number of federal, state, and local initiatives to combat teacher shortages that have been implemented in prior decades. And rather than going into every program or every policy that's been implemented, we've categorized these into 8 key classifications of policies. And what you see in the chart here, which I won't go into every single category, we list the category, what its overall goal is, as well as a couple of examples of specific programs within each category. So finally, turning to page 6, we present our issues for consideration for the legislature. The first being the policy focus. We recommend that the legislature focus on long-standing teacher shortage areas. These are the perennial shortage areas I mentioned in certain subject areas and certain types of schools, rather than broad overall policies for the entire teacher workforce. When looking at the various fiscal policy interventions that have been implemented, it seems that providing ongoing salary increases to teachers working in persistent shortage areas can be an effective strategy, more so than one-time bonuses, namely because with one-time bonuses you might get individuals entering into a shortage area for a short period of time and then leaving once the bonuses dry up. But these can be somewhat difficult to implement and controversial because many compensation decisions are determined at the local level and are locally bargained, so it's difficult for the state to implement these. Providing financial aid to individuals willing to work in persistent shortage areas can also be an effective strategy to sort individuals into these shortage areas, but less is known about their ability to attract new entrants into the market. When comparing the different models of financial aid programs, upfront tuition grants, such as the Governor's Teaching Fellowship, appear to be more effective than loan forgiveness programs such as Apple. Moving on to various support and outreach policies, research continually shows that new teacher support programs are generally found to be effective, such as new teacher induction programs. It's important to note that the state currently funds some of these efforts through its allocations as part of the local control funding formula. In prior years, we had categorical programs such as BITSA. In addition, as far as veteran teachers go, support programs can also be effective, but these are quite difficult for the state to implement because many of the issues that veteran teachers interact with or many that experience on an ongoing basis are somewhat unique to their individual situations. And as a result, this is where effective administrators can really play a key role. Finally, in terms of outreach policies, these can be an effective tool to re-engage former teachers who may be actively credentialed but out of the workforce or not currently working, as well as recruiting individuals from out of state. In any given year over the life of Prop 98, the percentage of teachers we've recruited from out of state has ranged from about 11 to 33%. Last year we were at about 24%, so that implies there is some room for growth. Finally, I want to highlight the point that the state is rather limited in the workforce data that it collects. As a result, the legislator lacks the data needed to answer very basic questions, such as what is the current active supply of teachers? These are teachers who are maybe not currently credentialed, but who are actually using their credentials. Therefore, developing a longitudinal data system, we believe, would enable the legislature to answer many important policy questions. And with that, I conclude my presentation.
Thank you. Moving now to Dr. Sandy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I very much appreciate the amount of work that the ledge analyst has put into this analysis. It's very helpful in the conversations that we're having statewide about shortages. I find their question or the suggestion that this situation may take care of itself to be slightly problematic, however. In 13-14, the commission issued, or in 14-15, the commission issued about 15,000 teaching credentials, including about 3,000 to teachers prepared out of state. The projected demand for the 15-16 year was 22,000. The gap of 7,000 teachers poses the question, who staffed those classrooms? It also poses the question, is that a real gap? And I really do also appreciate that we lack really good systems of doing labor market analysis in this sector. We have information from the Department of Education that keeps track of employment. We have information at the CTC that keeps track of credentialing. We don't have express permission to cross those two data systems and do the kinds of longitudinal analyses that would help us know how many credentials we issued, how many of those people went on to get jobs this year, how many are still teaching next year and the year after. And we do think that is a situation that needs some resolution, and it won't take much. I think a simple amendment to code authorizing the Commission and/or the Department of Education to do those kinds of analyses would enable us to begin to provide the kind of data that would help. But who's staffing those classrooms is an important question for us all. From one year to the next, this year, we saw last year in 14-15, we saw a 1% increase from the prior year in the number of fully credentialed teaching credentials we issued in California. We saw about 104% increase in the number of emergency permits that we issued to go staff classrooms. And that's problematic for the kids in those rooms. And we have pretty high expectations as we implement Common Core standards and very vigorous tests for students, and we look at putting accountability systems in play to evaluate our schools. The teacher is the most critical resource on the school site for getting that job done, and making sure every classroom has at least a competent teacher is a pretty high priority. So we're a little concerned that the problem won't take care of itself soon enough for all of the students in our schools, and that's something we should all be paying attention to. So I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have regarding Commission work in this area.
Okay, thank you. I've got a few, and I'm sure my colleagues have some as well. First of all, Mr. Kaplan, we had asked your office earlier to take a look at what other states in the union require a fifth year or extra year of teaching. In some cases now, with students taking 6 years to get their BA, it's actually a seventh year program. And I can't think of anything that would stifle entry into the teaching profession more than throwing an extra year on top of the first 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. So you did some research. Could you share that with everyone?
Yes, we've consulted various stakeholder groups, and what we've found from the responses we've received is that California is the only state to require this fifth-year program.
Okay, so if California is the only state to require it, and it is only common sense that that will have an adverse impact on the number of people going into teaching, if in fact it produces far better teachers, it may be worth it. So what data do we have, if any, to either one of you, to show that it produces far better teachers?
None, but I would like to, I'd like to point out that California actually allows multiple routes into the classroom, and I think Mr. Kaplan pointed this out. We do have a post-baccalaureate requirement, a 1-year or 2-year program that is a graduate level program. Most of the teachers in California come through that route. We also have, however, permission, and it's completely viable for colleges and universities to offer undergraduate teacher preparation programs. And there are some number of institutions that do. Many of the CSUs offer these programs. You may remember this from San Diego State, that there was an undergraduate track where a candidate could complete a degree program in a content area and a credential program, and in 4 or 5 years obtain a credential. That is not well utilized in California public colleges and universities. I've been talking to the deans of education in the different sectors, and what they're telling me is that they offer these programs. Most of the private institutions, for instance, offer this program because adding a 5th year at their prices is contraindicated. So they offer these programs, but many freshmen don't come into college knowing they want to be a teacher, and they may wander into art for a little while and then decide they want to be a teacher in their junior or senior year. At that point, they haven't taken the program necessary to get them a credential in 4 years, and they go for the graduate level program. So the third type of program we offer in California is the internship route, where someone with a BA can get some initial training and move into a job-based training program to become a fully credentialed teacher. In times of shortage, that's the area where we see the most growth. But we've taken the approach that we need to have multiple routes into teaching in order to accommodate the needs of California.
I think multiple routes are great. I don't think fifth year should be one of those multiple routes. Clearly, there is a negative incentive for faculty in colleges of education to encourage students to get out in 4 years, because they don't have jobs if students don't take a fifth year program by and large, or the jobs are largely reduced. On campuses, just for general background, I spent 27 years at San Diego State, and for 8 of those years, I was a dean in the College of Education, which is the producer of the fifth year program. And we always were absolutely certain that students who took the fifth year were far better than students who just got out with 4 years in any other state. We never did find any evidence of that, but we didn't share that lack of evidence because it would have meant we would have been out of jobs. So for students who were entering as freshmen, they weren't encouraged to go a different route. They were encouraged to go 4 years undergraduate and then an additional fifth year. It seems to me if we can't demonstrate that there's any advantage to doing that, it's kind of a wasted year. And if we've got plenty of teachers, so let them waste a year, no problem for the state. But if we're looking for teachers, the idea that most of our teachers, I'm sure most still come through a fifth year program, is problematic. And you talk about students who don't decide to go into teaching until they've been there a couple of years. I went to school at Indiana University, not to talk too much about my personal experience, but it was my junior year that I decided I didn't want to go to law school full time and have my parents pay, so I was going to teach during the day. So my senior year, I took 18 units of education courses and student teaching, and I got a teaching credential, and that was within the 4 years. If there had been a fifth year, I wouldn't have done it. It just seems it is such a negative factor on students going into teaching to know you've got to. It's one thing if your fifth year is in some degree program where you will make a lot of money for putting in the fifth year, but to put in the fifth year and make less. So I guess what I'm kind of getting at is, why do we have this fifth year if there's no evidence that it does any good outside of employing more teacher education professors?
I would say that we have it primarily so that late deciders or career changers, people who graduate and go into selling real estate but decide they might like to be a teacher, have a one-year program they can come back and complete. And that's why. It's a late decider model. The early decider, if you will, is the freshman or the sophomore in college that decides to do this while they're an undergraduate, and that exists in many of our colleges and universities, but it's not well utilized. The intern program is not for everyone. It's a hard row to hoe. If you don't have preparation before you get there, you need to have a lot of support in order to do a job.
This is probably something to discuss with the CSU in terms of,
Certainly,
yeah.
Jennifer Kuhn from the Ledge Analyst's Office. Just a related point. CTC earlier in the conversation was talking about this accreditation dashboard. What could we learn about teacher preparation? That might help answer some of your questions. What could we learn about whether a 4-year blended program, a 5-year program, going through no program but having a major in the subject that you teach, having a master's in the subject that you teach, going through a residency program, doing 6 months of student teaching versus 12 months of student teaching? I think the hope, at least from our office, was that if the state did invest in something like an accreditation dashboard, it would be able to show this individual came with this kind of training and was still there 3 years later, or a whole bunch of people that come with that kind of training, we lose them, and we lose them far more quickly than we lose folks coming from another avenue. That would take California being really strategic in the data that it collected so that it could have triggers for training and still employment. We could connect that data and see, are you still there 3, 5 years later?
Good, thank you. Move to Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your questions. That was very enlightening. Mr. Kaplan, how much time were you given to prepare your report?
Oh, our office has been working on it throughout the summer.
Okay.
We were just trying to be attentive last year to the kinds of conversations you were having, and many of your conversations were around the shortage area. So we tried to invest some time to see if we could be more helpful and not be quite as simplistic as just looking at new hires and new credentials, but trying to give you a little bit more context for the issue.
Well, I find it interesting on page 6, you know, we're saying we have a lack of data. So that means you probably had a tough time finding data as well. So I found on page 3 that your teacher turnover numbers were really interesting, that you have 15% per year, you stated, that leave. But of the 15%, 1/3 are retirees. So 5% are going to retire.
Just out of clarification, that is 1/3 of those teachers who leave the profession. So that is actually half of the 15% figure. It hovers generally around 2 to 3% in a year.
Well, you said that those switching schools were half.
Half.
So that's 7.5% of, and so I'm assuming that 1/3 of the 15% are retirement. So that leaves just 2.5% of teachers leaving for who knows what reason.
Forgive me if I was misleading in my comments earlier. Of the 15%, 7.5% leave the profession. And of those 7.5% that leave the profession, 1/3 of those individuals go on to retire.
So then about 2.5% are retirees.
That's correct.
And the other, okay, and then so that's about 5% then that leave and we don't know why.
That's correct.
Okay, so I'm trying to think of some reasons, because you didn't do SurveyMonkey or no one's contacted these people. So maybe their spouse got a job somewhere else and they left.
So actually, the federal government does do a survey, and we have looked at that data because this is
Okay.
national data. And so we do know a little bit about why they leave, and spouses moving is one of them.
Okay.
So relocating, working conditions, student behavior, student discipline, compensation. But interestingly, those folks who leave and say they're grumpy with their compensation are just slightly more than those who stay and say they're grumpy with their compensation. So, but that is like 1/3 of teachers who leave say compensation is at least part of the factors that made them leave.
So is this Census Bureau data? Or where-
It's conducted by the Department of Education. Every 4 years, they conduct a survey and then a 1-year follow-on with that initial sample of teachers.
So you said dissatisfaction with the workplace, so maybe that's poor management, where you've got a bad principal that you just said, I've had enough of working with. Okay, so 5 years education, and then you finally make it to be a teacher, and we have a declining enrollment. And so I didn't see that in the graphs. I see just teacher enrollment, but I don't see student enrollment. Do we have any data that shows? Because if LA Unified went down from 700 to 550, that's a 21% reduction. Is that?
Yeah, ADA, and LA is unique in California because it's been experiencing declining enrollment for something like 15 years. This is not a new phenomenon for LAUSD. And a number of places in California are just on long trajectories of declines, demographic, birth rate driven. Statewide, ADA is about flat, has been flat for the last 4-some years. When we look at finances projections over the next 5-some years, roughly flat. That's masking really big differences within the state. So this about 60% of districts are declining. Many of those are in urban areas, but there are a few urban areas in the Bay Area, for example, that are still growing. And then you have lots of areas like Riverside that are still growing substantially. So it's really, the conversation of declining enrollment is like half of the state's experiencing it, half is growing, and it's all washing out when we look at statewide numbers.
Okay, no, that's helpful. That is very helpful. And then we have what I call LIFO. And I experienced it when I became treasurer of the county. I had to lay off 11% of my staff. I was appointed and said, hey, we're in a bankruptcy, so now you lay off 11%. And all I could do was lay off all the new employees, all these great kids, you know, or employees that moved to management, and then I couldn't move them back down. And so I had to lay off some incredible experienced people. But the paradigm was not excellence. The paradigm was longevity. I couldn't get rid of identified unproductive employees. which is sort of what you do in the private sector. So if I got to downsize, I got to get rid of those that are, that are working against you. You have a bell curve, 25% work for you, 50% are just mediocre and do what they're supposed to do, and then 25% work against you. How do we, do the Jack Welch approach of, always revitalizing the system so everybody knows that they're being watched. So I wonder, now here I've got school districts that are saying we need to hire more teachers, but you laid them all off so you've got a declining enrollment. You've got an environment where you're going to spend 5 years to get in, and then you're going to be the first one out. So what motivates someone? What would motivate someone? And I'm sitting here going, the district's messed up. Not the state. The district's messed up in their negotiations. Somehow we need to rethink how we do things. And I'm speaking maybe to my former environment too, but maybe we have to have some kind of ratio. Say, okay, if you're going to do the LIFO method, if you're going to take out one new person, then you should be able to take out one old person too that isn't productive. Because we're seeing it even in police departments where young, new entry level officers are being laid off because the costs of running the police department are getting so high that they go first. And so we've got to figure out how to teach school board directors, elected officials, how to negotiate better to say, okay, we've got to figure out how to manage your workforce. And so, well, I'm just telling you, I'm just kind of venting a little to say, we've got to look at maybe some different tools as managers, because you're so disincentivizing new teachers, new police officers, new highway patrol. I mean, it's everywhere. And I'm just saying there's got to be a way to say to the unions, you created this problem, you better start figuring out how to fix it, and don't lay it here in Sacramento's porch. And that's all I have, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Morlock. Senator Allen.
Senator Morlock, my understanding is that LIFO is state law, and I think that in today's Sacramento Bee, there's an article about Assemblymember Bonilla's proposals in this area that you might want to take a look at.
Okay, thank you very much. I will.
There is something the state can do, in that the state does have rather prescriptive state law. But again, this is sort of a local and state issue going hand in hand, because the state has seniority rules that affect reassignments, hiring, transfers, layoffs, very specific rules on even how to break a tie if somebody started the same day. But many of those districts have wanted those, and the state has codified those. And at the same time, the districts over the recession were laying off new folks. They were also, many of them, offering early retirement benefits to try to get the more expensive folks to leave as well. And I might also suggest it's a much bigger issue, because we do know from some pretty reliable research that in general, first and second year teachers are not as effective as more experienced teachers. Now, there's going to be some districts that still say, but I worked so hard to find that person who's willing to work with my kids and my community, and I think they're going to be great if I could just hold on to them and give them enough time. And right now, state law really doesn't give them much flexibility to say, would you just let me hold on to them?
And that's another thing that I think Assemblymember Bonilla is looking to address. I mean, I remember that in my school district where a lot of the principals were told, if you have any doubt about this teacher, let them go, because there's not a lot of flexibility after they set foot on campus on day one of year 3. And one of the problems with that, of course, is if you actually start to think it out, if you have to pink slip them in March, you're doing a review basically in January, it's like a year and a half of teaching, and they have really no substantive time to prove themselves one way or another. My first year as an attorney, I wasn't very strong. I mean, I think everybody, there's a serious learning curve, and you see a lot of growth in teachers. By the time maybe they've been there 4 or 5 years, it's their habits are locked in one way or another. But it's an issue, and of course, if you start to poll teachers on this, they'll say that they think time to tenure ought to be 5 years. That you pull public school teachers themselves on this, and so I think that's another thing that Assemblymember Bonilla is looking to address in her legislation. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I just want to put in kind of building a little bit on what Marty's asking. I mean, ultimately, what what the evidence we've seen, and I know that we had a discussion about this at the Education Committee and kind of subsequently in the context of SB 933, but really giving teachers adequate support when they get going makes such a difference in both their quality as a teacher and also whether their retention as a teacher. And we've got this enormous retention problem. You asked some questions about it. My understanding from, and you alluded to it a little bit, is just this kind of general sense of preparation. We're oftentimes throwing our most inexperienced teachers into some of the most difficult teaching environments, and then not providing them with adequate support to really do what they need to do to be strong. And that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in this whole concept of clinical education in both in our ed schools and also teacher residency programs, to give them the sort of support that they need with a caring, experienced mentor teacher who's a high-performing teacher who can work with them and help them and assist them in getting their feet on the ground and becoming, confident, strong teachers, because we're not providing adequate support to our teachers now, and then we're so surprised when they sometimes sink rather than swim. And so that's why we're doing what we're doing with regards to teacher residency and SB 933 that'll be coming to the floor, I hope soon. Well, I guess it has to go through appropriations. But I appreciate your attention to this issue. It's an enormous one, and be on the lookout for the bills that are mentioned on page 24 of the analysis.
Senator Morlock.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Senator Allen, for pointing out Assemblywoman Bonilla's bill. I appreciate that. I didn't see that article, but I haven't seen the bill. But I appreciate the clarification of it's a state law. But call me a little cynical. I would think that law was put in at the behest of public employee unions. And so
sure, but when you're blaming, when you're trying to say Sacramento's not to blame, well, and it's the school districts, then we have to take some.
Right, but I've got to look at the root causes, and so we've all got to work together to say, okay, maybe the paradigm that you've preferred wasn't the best, and so we need to look at it. And that's why I really appreciate, Mr. Chair, your reflection on even your own program at San Diego State. I think it's just healthy. It's good dialogue, good discussion, good debate. And so thank you for the points.
Well, if I could just make one comment, and I can because I'm the chair, on root causes. I mean, I would just to avoid the union bashing here, the root causes of unions are employers who mistreat employees. So if we didn't have a long history of employers taking advantage of employees, we wouldn't have unions who had last in, first out clauses in their contracts. And with that, I would thank and excuse this panel. I know. Thank you.
So maybe now unions could be not bashing.
With that, we are moving now to the last segment of our hearing today, which is public comment. And if you would like to make a comment, please come forward. There are 4 seats at the table. We'll see how many of these seats get filled. If there's just one filled seat, we'll give you 2 full minutes instead of our typical 1.
And it's clearly an issue that we can talk about for a long time. And I really thank you all for a really thoughtful conversation. Sarah Lillis with Ed Voice. We recognize how important the work of the CTC is, and as you all do, in ensuring that every teacher in California is well prepared and well supported. And I think that there were some really important commitments that you and the governor made to that last year in terms of investing in the data system and the data dashboard. As was discussed by all of your last panelists, I think there's more work to be done when it comes to the data side. And I think as we begin to think about the teacher shortage issues, really being able to diagnose in a better way and have a better sense of what's happening. As you're talking about, we don't know if the 5th year is good or not because we don't have the information. And so I think the work the CTC is doing is very exciting. We do think that there's more to be done, particularly as it relates to looking at these teacher workforce issues and looking at teacher performance and really effective measures of tying it to effective measures of teacher performance so that we can know which programs are working best for which students or which areas. And in this last part of your conversation, you touched on one other issue that wasn't really talked about much, but was in your agenda, which is support for new teachers and particularly induction. As was mentioned, now it's being funded through LCFF, and while CTC is working on sort of recommendations generally about induction programs, we think that there's still an opportunity for the legislature to explore funding options there, because I think that it's critically important, whether it is a residency program there or these sort of formal induction programs like BudgetSub. New teachers do need extra help in the classroom, and I think that's something that's getting lost. So thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I'd like to thank all who participated today. A lot of very interesting discussion. I think we all learned a whole lot up here. With that, unless there's any further business for the committee, I will adjourn this meeting.